What if some of the facts you learned about Europe aren't facts at all? What if the maps you trusted quietly distorted reality? Today on Terra Spark, we're uncovering the European geography myths they never corrected, because sometimes they didn't exactly lie to you, but they definitely didn't tell you the whole truth. Let's begin. Part 1, the map problem. Let's start with the biggest misconception of all, the map itself. Most of us grew up looking at the same world map, the familiar rectangular one hanging in classrooms. But here's the uncomfortable truth. That map is distorted. It's called the Mercator projection. And while it's excellent for navigation, it dramatically reshapes how we perceive the world. On a Mercator map, northern countries appear much larger than they really are. Europe, especially, benefits from this illusion. For example, Greenland looks roughly the size of Africa. In reality, Africa is about 14 times larger. And Europe? It looks comfortably massive on classroom maps. But geographically, Europe is actually one of the smaller continents. Only Australia is smaller. The Mercator projection quietly exaggerates Europe's visual importance, simply because Europe sits farther north. So before we even talk about borders, the very map most people trust has already misled them. Part 2. Europe is not really a continent. Here's something that surprises many people. Europe is not a true continent, at least not geologically. From a physical geography perspective, Europe and Asia are part of one continuous landmass, Eurasia. There is no ocean separating them, no massive tectonic break, no clean natural division like you see between Africa and South America. Instead, the boundary between Europe and Asia is largely historical, cultural, and somewhat arbitrary. The commonly accepted border runs along the Ural Mountains, the Ural River, the Caspian Sea, the Caucasus Mountains, and the Bosporus Strait. But here's the key point. These boundaries were chosen by humans, not carved by nature in any definitive way. In fact, many geographers consider Europe a subcontinent of Eurasia, not a fully separate continent. So when we talk about Europe, we're partly talking about geography, but we're also talking about identity. And that distinction matters more than most people realize. Part 3, the highest mountain in Europe. You may have heard this in school. Mont Blanc is the highest mountain in Europe. It's a common answer. It's also, in most modern definitions, wrong. The true highest mountain in Europe is generally considered to be Mount Elbrus in the Caucasus Mountains. Height, Mont Blanc, about 4,808 meters. Mount Elbrus, about 5,642 meters. That's a huge difference. So why the confusion? Because it depends on where you place the Europe to Asia border. If you draw the boundary along the Caucasus crest, then Elbrus sits in Europe. If you place the boundary south of the range, some older traditions excluded it. But today, most geographic authorities, including mountaineering bodies, recognize Mount Elbrus as Europe's highest peak, meaning millions of students memorized the wrong mountain. Not because teachers lied, but because geographic definitions evolved. Part 4, the smallest country confusion. Ask almost anyone, what's the smallest country in Europe? Most will quickly answer, Vatican City. And technically, they're right. But the common understanding still misses something important. Because Europe contains several microstates whose sizes are astonishingly close, and whose geographic status is often misunderstood. Let's look closer. Yes, Vatican City is the smallest sovereign state in the world, at about 0.49 square kilometers. But consider these: Monaco, San Marino, Liechtenstein, and Malta. Here's what most people don't realize. Some of these countries are far more independent geographically than Vatican City, which is entirely surrounded by Rome. San Marino, for example, is one of the world's oldest republics and sits fully within Italy, yet operates as a completely independent state. Liechtenstein has no airport. Monaco is smaller than many city parks. Europe's political geography is far more fragmented and fascinating than the simple smallest country trivia suggests. Part 5. Scandinavia versus the Nordics. Here's a mistake even many Europeans make. People often use Scandinavia and Nordic countries as if they mean the same thing. They don't. Scandinavia traditionally refers to just 3 countries: Norway, Sweden, Denmark. That's it. But the Nordic region is larger. It includes Finland, Iceland, and several autonomous territories like the Faroe Islands and Greenland. Finland in particular is frequently mislabeled as Scandinavian. Geographically and linguistically, it's quite different. Finnish is not a North Germanic language like Swedish or Norwegian. It's part of the Finno-Ugric language family, closer to Estonian and distantly related to Hungarian. So when someone calls Finland Scandinavian, they're using the popular version, not the precise one. Part 6. The United Kingdom is not England. This one causes constant confusion worldwide. England is not the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom is a sovereign state made up of 4 countries: England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. Great Britain, meanwhile, refers only to the island containing England, Scotland, Wales, not Northern Ireland. And the British Isles? That's a geographic term that includes Great Britain, Ireland, and thousands of smaller surrounding islands. It's complicated, but here's the key takeaway. When people say England to mean the whole UK, geographically and politically, they're wrong. Part 7, Europe's East and West aren't geographic. You've probably heard countries described as Western Europe, Eastern Europe. It sounds geographic, but much of the time, it isn't. These labels were heavily shaped by Cold War politics. For example, Finland sits very far east geographically, but it's rarely described as Eastern Europe. Meanwhile, countries like the Czech Republic or Hungary are often called Eastern Europe, even though geographically they sit closer to the center of the continent. The terms Eastern and Western Europe are often historical, political, economic, not purely geographic, which means many mental maps people carry are shaped more by history than by actual latitude and longitude. Part 8. Europe isn't as cold as you think. Here's another quiet misconception. Because Europe sits relatively far north, many people assume it should be extremely cold. But Western Europe is surprisingly mild for its latitude. Why? One major reason: the Gulf Stream. This powerful Atlantic Ocean current carries warm water from the tropics toward Europe's western coast. It acts like a giant natural radiator. For example, London sits at roughly the same latitude as parts of southern Canada. Yet London's winters are dramatically milder. Without the Gulf Stream, much of Western Europe would have a climate far closer to Newfoundland or Labrador. Geography isn't just about where land sits. It's about how oceans move heat around the planet. Part 9. Switzerland's missing capital. Here's one that surprises even many Europeans. Most people will confidently tell you that the capital of Switzerland is Bern. But officially, Switzerland doesn't actually have a capital city. That's right. The Swiss constitution never names one. Instead, Bern is designated as the federal city, the seat of government, and in practice it functions exactly like a capital. But legally, the country simply never made it official. Why? Because Switzerland has always emphasized its federal structure, a careful balance between its regions and cantons. Avoiding a formal capital was partly symbolic, a way of saying, power here is meant to be shared. It's a small technical detail, but it perfectly reflects how uniquely Switzerland is organized. Sometimes geography myths aren't completely wrong, they're just simplified. Part 10. Iceland and Greenland, the name Myth. Here's one of Europe's most famous geographic misunderstandings. Many people assume the names say it all. Iceland must be covered in ice. Greenland must be relatively green. But reality tells a very different story. Iceland, despite its dramatic glaciers, is largely green along its coasts, especially in summer. Warm ocean currents help keep its climate milder than many places at similar latitudes. Greenland, on the other hand, is dominated by a massive ice sheet covering most of the island. So how did the names end up feeling backwards? The answer goes back to the Vikings. According to the Icelandic sagas, the Norse explorer Eric the Red named Greenland in the late 10th century, partly to attract settlers to the new colony. It was, in a sense, early medieval marketing. To be fair, the southwestern coastal fjords where the first settlers arrived do turn green in summer, but the vast interior of Greenland was, and still is, overwhelmingly ice. Meanwhile, Iceland's name likely came from early explorers encountering sea ice during harsh winters, not from any attempt to mislead. So the famous name swap isn't exactly a lie, but it is definitely misleading. Another reminder that in geography, as in history, names don't always tell the full story. Europe looks simple on the map, clean borders, familiar countries, neat textbook facts, but as we've seen, many of the things people know about European geography are oversimplified, outdated, or quietly misunderstood. The truth is more complex, more interesting, and far more human. Because geography isn't just lines on a map, it's history, politics, culture, and sometimes a story we've been telling the easy way for a very long time. If this changed how you see the map, subscribe to Terra Spark for more hidden geography, surprising truths, and the stories the Atlas never explained. And tell us in the comments, which fact surprised you the most?